Welcome. My name is Joshua Grubb. I'm the coach at ARC Running. We have Eric Laterhouse here also. He's our physical therapist. Talk about a bit of a subject that is, I think, overlooked by too many or taken for granted. And to some who've delved into it a little deeper, it's actually somewhat debated even. So just gonna highlight some of those key discussion points and go from there. Just as an overview, I've been running for 30 years, college, high school, middle school, currently as well. My background is in kinesiology with a coaching emphasis. I also worked as a student trainer with an athletic trainer in college, had a lot of sports medicine interaction, which began my, I think, real appreciation of that side of things, including my own injury experiences. And so love partnering with Eric as a physical therapist. And I've been coaching for 13 years now, a lot of high school athletes, cross country and track, and some private clients, middle schoolers up to adults. Most lately have been focusing my training on marathons, half marathons, the most recent being Boston last April. So as an overview, good to understand the term, just to make sure we're on the same page, talk about what it can do and talk about what it cannot do specifically, and then end with some practical suggestions. Basically, what stretching is by definition is a lengthening of the muscles, tendons, soft tissue. That's like literally what's happening, as you would expect. General categories that can be described for stretching are acute, which is what you would do before, after an activity. But then you can also think of chronic stretching as that stretching which you do over a long period of time, because they each have also different benefits or effects, what you do just once or in an isolated moment versus what you do over time. They're very connected, but just like with training, the benefits and therefore expectations from what you can get from them are slightly different or should be. Types of specific stretching generally discussed. Most people, when they think of stretching, are thinking of static stretching, where you're holding a position for a certain amount of time. Dynamic stretching, which we'll talk about a number of times, especially going forward, or active stretching, is where you're actually basically stretching. So again, you're lengthening the musculotendinous unit through motion, hence the term active. So it might be moving through a range of motion like a leg swing or butt kickers, side steps, lots of different ways of doing it. Finally, less known, but sometimes used effectively in PT work, especially, I think, pre-contraction or PNF. Basically, this idea of you can do this even when you're sitting somewhere, but contracting, relaxing, and that's a small, very controlled way of essentially stretching as well. So use more specifically that last one in very targeted contexts. Most people, again, are focusing on static probably, and then those who are a little more advanced, I'd say, in understanding training are going to be using dynamic stretching more. Building upon that, movement depends on your range of motion. That's the key. As runners, we want to think about what is stretching and how does it benefit, if at all, my movement and my ability to run. And so that range of motion is kind of the key term that will be emphasized throughout this. Because if you don't have a range of motion, if there is tightness, that is a result of tension in the tissue, which can be caused by a number of things, active or passive. But that's going to limit your range of motion. And if your range of motion is limited, your running ability is essentially going to be limited, especially when you're trying to be competitive and get speed increase. But in general, there are going to be problems when that range of motion is constricted. I mean, we all kind of know what that sense of tightness is. And it can be in two sort of subcategories of thought. There's passive tightness, which is through postural adaptations or scarring. So it's from injuries that occur over time, or just like sitting in a desk chair that's maybe even not ergonomic or whatever. Like those are starting to cause tightnesses because our body's adapting to the posture or even certain activities that can create tightness in the limbs. Maybe something's being overworked. So that's passive. Active would be it's actively spasming or contracting from a number of causes. So most importantly, what can stretching do? This is based on, and I'll show at the end, a reference list of just scratching the surface of the research that has gone into the subject, because there is a lot of research, and a lot of it is quite contentious with itself because you have the limitations of study groups, what kind of people are being studied, etc. So that's where the conversation is so mixed. But what science and experience has demonstrated is that stretching at a physiological level, it's going to help keep muscles long, flexible, lean, and thereby, and we'll talk about this, unpack it a bit more, reduce the risk of overstressing the tissue by overexertion. Basically, without stretching, without that flexibility, muscles cannot lengthen to their fullest potential, which can then have problem effects like joint pain, strains, muscle damage. So basically, if the goal is range of motion at its best, which is influenced by the health of the muscles, their elasticity, that helps all sorts of things in life, from balance, which is one of the most key ones, to just basic movement. Stretching can also help align collagen fibers if you think of the fibers of a muscle, and that's just part of the healing and pain management process. It can produce, to a degree, also even reduced muscle soreness. And there's more. As suggested, lower back pain, and as Eric can speak to especially, is a really common problem among runners and the general population, because so much is connected to the back from the neurological side of all the spine, but just it's kind of the center point, the lower back of the whole body. So when things get askew, the lower back suffers. And so stretching can help with that posture. And absolutely, it's part of the discussion when you talk about running form and posture. And it can be a chicken or the egg situation of what causes what. Sometimes the lower back is the problem, but sometimes it's just receiving the problems from elsewhere, like quads, hamstrings, other muscles being too tight and not flexible enough. But there are even mental benefits to consider with stretching. If you've ever done races, or even just with training, or people who've enjoyed yoga and those kind of things, there's like a kind of ritual when you do stretching. And it can be very calming because you're often partnering it with deep breathing, but it can be part of the ritual of getting ready for a race and dealing with all those nerves, that before, after activity type of dynamic, or even just waking or before you go to bed. I love to stretch out a bit when I wake up in the morning because I feel a little stiff getting out of bed, especially if I've had some hard workouts the last few days. So it just helps get my sense of wakefulness, but also just feel looser and more limber, which is essentially saying it's like woken up my range of motion. I feel like I can move freely, unrestricted. And there's even studies that suggest it can help combat stress, stretching by releasing tension points, and especially when it's connected to the neurological system, that it can not only alleviate muscle tension, but just relax your body in general. I think most people love things like yoga or yoga partnered with like meditative practices and deep breathing because it's relaxing at a basic level. So that's another benefit that stretching has, mental and physical. Furthermore, more to the point of runners and performance, there is suggestions from research that it can improve performance and maybe even reduce the risk of injury. It's relative. There's a lot of variables to consider, but bringing back that term dynamic stretching, studies have shown that that can demonstrate a small percentage of enhancement in performance as a runner. It needs, again, a certain context, and it has to be partnered with certain things and done correctly. But generally, they've found through studies that dynamic stretching can have a positive effect on actual results of performance. And when you get to a certain level, even if it's just 1.3% of an enhancement, that can be huge for getting that personal best. On our website, we have a video collection of dynamic stretches I use and I use with athletes. Usually dynamic stretching is achieving kind of two things at the same time. There's elements of it that are like stretching and opening up that range of motion, but there's also an aspect that is warming up the body at a second level. Dynamic stretching always needs to follow some kind of warm up, easy run, other things that can be done. So it's never something you just usually go straight into, but it can also be as simple as standing against a wall and just doing a full leg swing, just to open up the hips. So there are a lot of varieties and people can figure out which ones work best for them. It's often partnered with a warm-up element and or reinforcement strengthening elements. But again, the key of it, of thinking of dynamic stretching as a form of stretching that has benefits potentially for a runner, is that it's influencing that range of motion. While range of motion may not be caused by the increased muscle length per se, our improved range of motion can be influenced by stretch tolerance, basically the ability to withstand stretching force. So dynamic stretching isn't necessarily influencing how flexible or how long the muscle gets, but it is developing the elasticity. The rubber band analogy is probably the easiest way to think about it. If you think of a good, healthy rubber band, it has a certain amount of stretch and resistance to go back to its starting point. And that's kind of the ideal with our tissue, with our muscle tendon combination, is that they're healthy. They can stretch a certain length and then return with all that kinetic energy. Because contrarily, if you think of an old rubber band, if that's a metaphor for tissue that has not been worked on consistently, like with stretching, you pull it to a certain extent, and it might rip, or it may not be as bouncy in terms of its pullback. And that's where the concern is. So there's that slight improvement of performance potential, but also partner with it is the reduced injury risk. And that's where that rubber band analogy, I think, is particularly helpful. We don't want that rubber band to tear. We want it to be strong and remain strong, which takes some work with our muscles and tendons. But with that also, with that training of range of motion through things like dynamic stretching, it's reinforcing that strength of tension pulling back and forth and that kinetic energy. Before we delve into the final element of practical things, so what do we do with it? It's good to know what can stretching not do based on research. So stretching by itself will not prevent injury. You can't just stretch and expect that to be the save all, basically. It's all about how it's partnered with other things, usually strengthening exercises, a certain type of stretching, partnered with warming up properly. I mean, health, nutrition, rest, sleep, all these things start contributing to each other in the whole picture. There's no one thing by itself that will fix all the things. They need to partner together. So when people say stretching doesn't do anything for you, that's true to the extent of, yeah, by itself, you can't just stretch more and expect to prevent injury. Because there's a lot of factors even involved with injury. A chronic injury is usually going to be contributed by, it could be tightness issues, but those tightness issues are usually a symptom, not the cause. And they're usually a symptom of the mechanics of your running form or just general lifestyle, like postural things. It could be from training errors, just running too aggressively too soon when the tissue is not adapted. Even a healthy rubber band can only take so much tolerance if you pull it way beyond its limit. And we all have limits. And so there are a lot of factors. An acute injury, obviously, a truck runs into you, no amount of stretching is going to prevent bones and tissue from being damaged by that, or a nasty fall. That's a little more obvious, but the more common injuries are chronic. There's more layers to them than flexibility. Flexibility and tightness can be a symptom and definitely something we look at, but it's usually connected to a number of other things like biomechanics, running form, or training errors. That's what Eric and I are definitely first looking at least when we're assessing a situation. So to build upon that a little bit, there's even studies that show like acute stretching, when you think of just standing, doing toe touches or like flamingos, doing that kind of stretching prior to an activity actually has detrimental effects to performance. And there's, again, biomechanics to explain upon that. But basically, I think of it as it's almost like you're getting too loose. You're kind of stealing some of that tension that you want before a performance in your muscles and tendons. We don't want to be fully loose. You're not a gymnast. It's also very sports specific, but for runners, you don't need an extreme range of motion to be a healthy runner. Again, you don't need to be able to do the splits. So that can actually have a detrimental effect on the kinetic potential of our tissue in running where it needs to be firing and like that rubber band springing back into action. And that, again, has to do with studies of acute static stretching. So just standing still before a run. There can be a place arguably for static stretching after exercise, but generally studies are showing a decreased performance from doing it prior. That's why, again, dynamic stretching studies show more mixed results towards positive, again, depending on how you're partnering it with your warm-up routine and or just training in general. So dynamic stretching has been shown generally to have improvements in things like endurance, while static does not. Static stretching can kind of create this, what they call stretch-induced strength loss. I remember when I was a younger runner, you could do all this stretching and it almost makes you feel lethargic, like you're ready to take a nap, which is not what you want to be doing right before a race. So it has a time and place, but before running, it's been found not to be really beneficial in any way, with very few exceptions, maybe if there's an exceptional amount of tightness to address. But again, it's about partnering that with proper warming up. I mentioned some of these things just to demonstrate that there's also a lot of mixed results and debate among really smart scientific people on these issues. So some of it leaves then room for, experimentation. Furthermore, there's the caveat of, again, sports specificity. And they found potentially with static stretching even that sports or activities that require bouncing and jumping at a high intensity, so usually not so much distance running, but maybe for sprinters or other athletes, that stretching and having that sort of really ready elastic energy is critical. Distance runners can get away with more because of the lowered intensity usually of the activity, depending on the race distance and effort. But there are certain sports and certain activities where it becomes even more important. So just as a caveat to that, keeping again context in mind is so important and what the demands of that physical activity are going to be. If you're doing extremely fast things, whether it's in a gym, stair running, whatever, running or not, that flexibility could be more and more important to prevent injury. Because again, if you think about rubber band, distance running might be a slow pull of that band, which can tolerate a lot more. But if you're doing stair running, for example, at a high intensity, that's being pulled really fast and very intense. So it needs its fullest potential of elasticity. And if it isn't, the risk for injury is just elevated of tearing or damaging the tissue. So with that, what do we do with it? Thinking specifically as runners, but in general, even the key, I think, to take away with stretching is that consistency is essential. Think about the nature of chronic stretching. Stretching once is a good start. Its impact, its benefits are minimal versus, like with training in general, it has to be done consistently over time to really appreciate and feel the benefits. It will literally take weeks to months to increase flexibility, but you can do it. And you have to continue doing it to maintain it. And that's just like the principles of training itself. Allow amounts of time to build up strength and power and endurance. Same thing with flexibility. Equally as important, though, is proper technique, because bad technique can cause more harm than good. That's true with any exercise. Same thing with stretching. There's ways to do it that maybe is pulling angles in the wrong way that can cause problems. So just checking that posture technique is good. And with that, symmetry, making sure it's not all focused on one side or one group, but considering all the major groups and that it's equal on both sides, because a lot of injury issues that come from running form issues come from some kind of imbalance in that running form. None of us are perfectly symmetrical in our form, but the more we're aware of it, the more we try to address any imbalances we notice, the better we will be. And flexibility can be a part of that. Furthermore, making sure that in our activity of choice, that those major muscle groups are being addressed. So for runners, it can be, and this is where sports specificity comes in, especially in which dynamic stretches you pick, activating and working on the range of motion for like the hips, the knees, the ankles. Those are our three key ones as runners. And then arguably you can work up the chain because our arms, like our shoulders, neck, back, they're all part of it as well. But the key, and Eric can speak to this as well, is probably the hip area. So it's just so much passing through that and going back up. So a lot of stretching is addressing the hip area. Knees, ankles also critical, but that hip joint dynamic is essential. But furthermore, with practicing good stretching, consistent, sport specific, is allowing some kind of warm up prior because you want that blood flow to be increased, which makes the tissue more pliable and amenable to being stretched, essentially. And as a footnote, there are chronic conditions or injuries where more adaptation is needed in terms of maybe not doing certain types of stretches, at least for a period of time. If something's damaged, you shouldn't be stretching it. And that's where a PT like Eric can help particularly give a lot of guidance in terms of the time and place for certain things. Briefly, just noting, there's very specific scientific studies that have been done on the subject and beyond. So this is not just a general like runner's world discussion, as much as those can draw from research, but like there's actual science and biomechanics studying these things. And that's where we're getting the mixed bag of results. But hopefully the general principles and takeaway can be informative or just reaffirming what you need to do to reduce risks of injury, to potentially improve performance, and or at least by improving range of motion and form, thereby improving performance and more, and just feeling generally better and more balanced. We have on our site some self-guided flexibility, strength, and motor control assessments just as a way to check in with yourself, see where you're at, see if there's any obvious tightness areas. Or absolutely, if you have questions, want to get really specific into your history and context, talking with Eric as a physical therapist if you've had injury issues that keep creeping in, or talk to me about training and the strategies therein. We are here to help as much as possible. So the general routine I've guided myself and athletes through will do a pre-run sort of warm-up routine, which is like preliminary base level dynamic stretching. Coming from work, you've probably been sitting all day or whatever. So it's nice to kind of loosen up the body and the range of motion before. And that can take as little as 5 to 10 minutes. Then usually do a short run, warm-up run, we're using dynamic stretching before a workout, like in a higher intensity workout or race. I don't think dynamic stretching has to be part of every run, especially like easy days. So there's the pre-run warm-up, which is 5-10 minutes, some kind of warm-up run relative to conditioning. And then dynamic stretching itself, like the routine we go through, that can take 5 to 10 minutes at the most, depending on how many times you want to do things. So it doesn't really take a lot of time.
Clinically, from a PT standpoint, I do, of course, see a lot of people have restrictions in tissue length. But on the flip side, I see people that are pretty flexible, but also feel tight. And I notice this in runners, and they feel tight in their backs and their hips, and they can one and D feel tight, but some people do the splits and still feel tight. And what I gathered from that over the years is that people aren't strengthening well. So my hypothesis there is there might be more muscle tone for the weakened tissue. Say going for the run and my hips feel tight. And so when we strengthen, that sense of tone kind of goes down because you just get more support and stuff like that. If you keep stretching and nothing's changing, then you might have to think strengthening is an added component.
I like to put static stretching after the workout because I think it has an absolute place. Or just you can static stretch any time of the day. It's just what I addressed with static stretching right before activity doesn't necessarily have benefits, but it doesn't mean it's not good in any other time. So yeah, there's the more dynamic stretching pre-run or getting ready for activity, static maybe more after, or just in general life, it's like yoga and those kind of things. And that covers a lot. And anyone who does those, even if it's just 5 minutes at the most at the end, because generally a stretch, if it's held at least 10 seconds, it's starting to have benefits for static stretching. Just do that. It takes less than 5 minutes at the end of a run. And again, the benefits for balance, a sense of just relaxation, potentially recovery are all gained. Such a little investment of time. I think it can be either at times, depending on the need. Sometimes when there's a lot of stiffness, rolling can be a great way to just try to loosen it up. And in a way, also encourage blood flow. I definitely emphasize rolling out, massaging post activity. It's a great thing to do after the activity is done. It doesn't have to be literally right after activity, but after some time. And then maybe follow with a little more stretching because the rolling kind of helps the muscles, again, warm up a little bit for that flexibility. And then sometimes if there's high level of soreness, putting ice on it after that. So it's rolling and then stretching a bit more and then icing, because that combination I find is very effective at recovery. And then sometimes just loosening up. I'll roll first thing in the morning when I'm stiff and recovering from hard workouts and runs, just to, again, loosen up and feel that range of motion improvement just for getting going in the day.
I do want to mention something about foam rolling too. I think it's fantastic to get the blood flow going. I think people overdo it maybe for IT band syndrome. It can help reduce adhesions, but doesn't quite get the IT band flexible.